Hi. First of all, thank you so much for coming out here. I really appreciate all the work that you've been doing for Muslim women. And I had a question regarding how, as you said, with the gender-based specifics for the man possessing the, and how does that, is it more gender-based versus economic-based? As women start to have their own money and enter in the workforce and whatnot, it's not so much clearly that the man would provide a dowry so much and that he would be owning the contract of marriage. So how does that play into the 21st century in regards to that? Is it economic or is it gender-based?
I think this is one of those areas where what we're seeing is that particular rules that worked more or less well as part of a coherent system no longer function in their totality. We end up with certain things like dower becoming sort of symbolic, and then both spouses under civil law, not just in the United States, but say in Morocco, for instance, with the recent reform of the Mudawana or elsewhere, having equal civil rights within the marital partnership. We see this as a very different kind of marriage. What hasn't happened yet is an attempt to reconcile those things, an attempt to say, if we're not going to base marriage on this particular legal foundation, and in point of fact, in most of the Muslim world, nobody talks about ownership or dominion or control, right? You may still have talaq, right? Because it is this kind of central symbolic element in the construction of Muslim masculinity, right? It's very threatening to talk about doing away with talaq for all kinds of reasons. Just like it's threatening to talk about doing away with dower because this is, there's a lot of social stuff that goes along with this, right? But what do? Muslim marriages are not really any longer based on this analogy to ownership or control, and yet we have these vestiges of this system. So how do we make it work? What kind of new sets of regulations can be put into place? Is there an alternate contractual model? Do we think of a partnership model, right? What would that mean? How do you negotiate that? How do you deal with the fact that there are explicit Quranic passages that talk about a different model? Do you say, well, in the 7th century, this was the appropriate model, and we're doing something different now? In practice, virtually everywhere Muslims are doing something different, but actually admitting to that and saying we've chosen not to use this anymore becomes complicated, right? That's a very fraught kind of move. And it'll be interesting to see what Professor Anwar has to say in January. I mean, he's the one who's really addressing these kinds of questions about Islamic law and the contemporary nation-state system. And you should come back and ask him.
Yeah, that's on January 15th, and you can sign up for our newsletter for the events on that. So.
See, we got the plug-in for that.
Thanks. So.
Absolutely.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
I know a case where a Muslim got involved in a domestic dispute, and the brother was beating his wife. The police were called. When the police arrived, this brother used the verse in the Quran, and I know you're probably sure what verse I'm going to mention.
I know what verse you're going to say.
It gives him the permission to beat his wife. The translation actually says beat her lightly. The word in the Quran is adribu. And the word is daraba, which is a hit in the first form. But if you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's in the fourth form in the Quran.
It's not, it's in the imperative.
Okay.
Which is why it's wa idribuhuna.
Okay.
Right? So that, and it's wadribu because you conjoin the waw with the...
So if you could comment on that, because this brother was actually, doing more than even the translation said. He was physically abusing her.
Right. And
he used that as justification.
I think this speaks to the issue of, first of all, he should not have done that. That is a bad thing. Right? So let's just be very clear. Right? Regardless of the words in the Quranic text, he should not have done that. And the fact that he's justifying himself by reference to the Quranic text is, I think, a perversion of many things about that text and about what it means to be a moral human being, let alone a good Muslim. So that is a starting point. The fact that he's quoting the Quran to justify this, I think actually speaks to something that stems out of what has been in some ways a positive development in Muslim communities, which is the democratization of scriptural interpretation and the increasing familiarity of lay Muslims with meanings of the Quran. But the flip side of that democratization of interpretation is that people turn to the text and assume that they can understand it, right? When in fact, there is a voluminous tradition of serious and subtle and sometimes mind-bendingly misogynist and sometimes unbelievably humanistic and subtle interpretation of the range and the depth of the meanings in this text. And so when you assume that you can go to the text and you can look at it and you can look at the English translation and maybe memorize the Arabic phrase and then be able to say what it says, you've really departed from the Muslim tradition as it was historically practiced for centuries. So what you find if you go back to the medieval commentaries on that verse taken as a whole, which starts out, الرجال قوامون على النساء, men stand over women or men stand up for women. It gets translated in all these kinds of ways as protectors and maintainers or breadwinners or guardians or in charge of. The whole framing of this verse is about a particular kind of social relationship. It's assumed to be about a marital relationship, and it's assumed to be both about a kind of unconditional preference that God has given to men more than women, and also a kind of conditional authority that comes from a marital transaction where men support women and women obey men. This is what all of this interpretation says. I think it's really a good thing that people are reinterpreting this text. I think there should be more women interpreting the Quran and other texts, but I also think that the bypassing of all of this interpretive literature as sort of tainted because of the patriarchal presuppositions of its interpreters, and they lived in the 14th century and the 10th century and the 12th century. Of course they were patriarchal, right? And of course they were men who saw things in a particular way because that was how society was set up. Bypassing this whole tradition means that there's an assumption that you take the words and then you know what they mean and then you apply them. Whereas even most of these sort of deeply patriarchal exegetes felt perfectly reasonable saying, yeah, absolutely, the word means strike. The lightly is Yusuf Ali's addition. It's not there in the Arabic text. He's getting it from the commentaries, where they're saying, yeah, okay, it means strike, fine. Oh, but let's bring in the example of the Prophet ﷺ, who said, do not strike God's female servants, right? And so because there's this kind of Quran centrism and this reluctance to go outside the text, and a willingness to discount the interpretive tradition for some good reasons, in some cases, we get things like people saying, but the Quran says I can.
Right. And that comes up frequently in the work that we do.
Yeah, and that's kind of a possible influence from sort of American quasi-Protestant culture, in which the Bible is seen as something that's self-interpreting, and you completely ignore all of the history. So it's very common in the American context for someone to say, well, it's right here in the Bible, right in these words, ignore what every commentator has written, and then you apply that directly to your situation. And even if you're not Protestant, this way of thinking permeates American culture. So, this is just something we, as Muslims, are going to have to look out for.
Right. I will also, I think, in fairness, point out the flip side of that, which is when somebody's interpreting, for instance, the first verse of that same surah, which says, يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها O people, revere your Lord who created you from a single soul and created from it its mate, and from the two of them countless men and women spread far and wide. Well, you know, I was once at a wedding where the imam recited this in far more melodious Arabic than I could ever do. And then he said, and the English translation of this is, God created Adam, and out of Adam created Eve. So there are some benefits to sticking to the Quran and only the Quran. Right?
I know one of the reasons I think I started doing the reading on my own way back when I was in college age was because I'd read translations by, or interpretations by people like Maulana Maududi that's so misogynistic. I was, you know, I mean, to remain a Muslim and to really get the spirit of Islam, I had to kind of look at it on my own. So it was such a blessing when I read Dr. Amina Wadood's, you know, Quran and Women, and I think she's in the audience somewhere. I just wanted to, and so I was also thrilled to read this, to see that more women are going into.
I don't expect this will have quite the global impact of that, but it's a modest contribution that builds on what other people have done.
Yeah. Well, that's thank you so much for your questions.